Hello everyone, I'm Allie and welcome to my podcast on Procreative Beneficence. Do you want your children to live the best lives possible? Of course, most people would agree and say yes. But should you be obligated to do everything in your power to make this happen? For instance, women are obligated to discontinue any alcohol consumption during pregnancy for the sake of their baby's health. But what if you had the choice between embryo A, which is genetically predisposed to diabetes, or embryo B, which isn't? Should you be obligated to choose embryo B over embryo A, just as the mother is obligated to give up drinking? And what if doctors could edit your baby's genome to make them taller, smarter, and more athletic? Would it be wrong for you to turn down the offer? I am going to argue that procreators should not be obligated to select the embryo with the most desirable traits because undesirable traits are essential for the advancement of our society as a whole. Now, when I use the term desirable traits, I'm referring to traits which are expected to provide the child with the best quality of life in today's society or their current environment. Although some traits may not be beneficial to an individual in all aspects of their lives at all times, I believe these naturally occurring traits, whether it be blindness or diabetes or gender dysmorphia, are essential for the development of our healthcare and education systems. Furthermore, traits that reduce a person's well-being in today's society are the same ones that will push social institutions to accommodate these individuals. I believe that in most cases, it is the environment that needs to change, not the individual, to provide the best quality of life. To understand this better, there are two technologies you should become familiar with. First, in vitro fertilization. It is the process by which a female egg is fertilized by a male sperm outside of the body, for instance in a test tube. These two cells form a zygote, or an embryo, which is then implanted in the female's uterus. Second, pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, or PGD, involves analysis of the embryo's genes to determine the specific disease and non-disease traits the child will most likely be born with. This conversation really starts with a bioethicist named Julian Savulescu. He argues for the principle he calls Procreative Beneficence. It states that couples or single reproducers should select a child who is expected to have the best life based on the available information. This means that those using in vitro fertilization are obligated to use PGD and select the best embryo of those possible. He argues that this goes for both disease and non-disease traits, regardless of the social inequality that may follow. For instance, procreators are morally required to discard embryos with a genetic predisposition to cystic fibrosis, and they're morally required to select the embryo predicted to have the highest IQ. And if those with a low IQ feel degraded in any way, shape, or form, they must deal with that. Procreators should not hold back. Savulescu says that according to hedonistic, desire fulfillment, and objectiveless theories, traits such as intelligence should be selected for as they provide the life with the most well-being. At the end of the day, he believes procreators should be free to make the choice. However, physicians can justifiably persuade procreators to use the information available. So which traits are on the chopping block? Elizabeth Gedge argues against procreative beneficence. She believes that while PGD tests for healthy embryos, it sends the message that persons with disabilities are unhealthy and therefore inferior. This is known as expressivism. This means their lives are not worth living, which increases discrimination against those with disabilities, and maybe even legitimizes it. PGD uses a dualistic logic. It divides us into healthy and unhealthy people based on genetic health norms. She argues this way of thinking has consequentialist and symbolic harms. These symbolic harms deprive persons with disabilities of their moral status, which could eventually take away their rights and privileges. Overall, she believes there must be a balance between reproductive choice, advancing medical knowledge, reducing future suffering, and respecting the moral status of all citizens. The next critic of procreative beneficence I'd like to introduce is Ben Saunders. He argues for what he calls the principle of generalized procreative non-maleficence. There are two parts of this principle. One, satisficing. This means that procreators should only focus on selecting the embryo expected to have a satisfactory well-being. And two, generalized, meaning procreators should be focused on how their child will affect others. Kitty corner on the diagram, in the top left quadrant, is procreative beneficence. Saunders describes this principle as maximizing, in that it forces procreators to select embryos with the greatest possible life, and individualistic, because it focuses solely on the child being born and not others. Saunders believes the principle of procreative beneficence is a genuine moral obligation, but his principle is a more credible alternative. He believes procreative beneficence is a lightweight principle, which means when it conflicts with more important moral principles, they should dominate. Let's go back to the initial thought experiment I proposed. Embryo A has a genetic predisposition to diabetes, while embryo B doesn't. Is it morally wrong to select embryo A? According to Silvescu, it is morally wrong to choose embryo A because given the evidence, it is not expected to have the best life. On the other hand, Saunders' principle recommends choosing embryo B because embryo A has the potential to symbolically harm others. Now, our last perspective comes from Alan Holland. He believes that no compelling reasons have been given thus far, which forces us to adhere to the principle of procreative beneficence. He says it's based on one particular conception of the best life. Therefore, this principle has a limited application. For example, some procreators want to create the child that will serve God the best, while others aim to produce the child with the best virtues, and some want the child to live the most worthwhile life. In all of these instances, it is unclear what parents ought to do to produce the child that correlates with their own conception of the best life. Holland argues there are no obvious material, mental, or genetic qualities which lead to the best life in question. Perhaps the concept of well-being not only relies on the procreator's conception, but it's relative to the environment that they will live in. In 1921, scientists at University of Toronto were the first to successfully treat diabetes with insulin. 100 years later, we've learned how to mass-produce insulin with transgenic bacteria and the use of bioreactors. Now, Canadians have access to affordable insulin. It can be picked up at nearly any drugstore, and it's present in every hospital. It is precisely health conditions such as diabetes which have transformed our healthcare system and advanced our scientific methods. Citizens have come together to change our society and accommodate those with diabetes. In my books, the sociological evolution of our society is more important than the physiological one. And rather than pushing for change in our education and healthcare systems, the mentality of just deleting the allele is essentially a cop-out. If we apply the principle of procreative beneficence to transgender people, procreators would be obligated to select the embryo least likely to experience transgenderism. How so? Well, in today's society, transgender people experience more harassment, more discrimination, and are frequently refused medical care, to say the least. Therefore, embryos predisposed to transgenderism will have a diminished well-being and should not be selected. But I believe transgender people are pushing our healthcare and education systems to do better. And in the future, once they have been properly accommodated, they will live just as great of a life as cisgender people. We should be focusing on coming together to help those whose needs are not met in today's society. Then we will all have equal opportunity of living the best lives possible, regardless of physiological and psychological conditions. Now, Julian Savolsky might say, social discrimination against transgender people is an issue that should be resolved on its own, outside of reproductive decision-making. We can achieve equality while we focus on living the best lives possible. But I disagree. I think these two issues are so intertwined that the application of procreative beneficence would destroy any progress made towards social justice. I think Cebulski has failed to recognize that artificial selection of our species hinders our evolution as a society. The principle of procreative beneficence has one important shortcoming. Well-being is relative to the environment of the individual. For instance, transgenderism may not promote the most well-being in today's society, but in the future, transgender people may have just as great of a life as cisgender people. Above all, it's the environment that needs to change, not the individuals within it. So I hope you guys have come to realize, if you haven't already, that there's more to being a physician than just biology and science. You'll be faced with issues such as procreative beneficence in your future career, and it'll be your responsibility to address patients' ethical concerns when it comes to PGD, IVF, chemotherapy, vaccines, or other treatment. Thank you for listening. See you guys next time.